In Alaska, winter can feel less like a season and more like a verdict. In the interior, temperatures have been recorded at around -80°C, cold enough that exposed skin can burn in minutes, and even metal seems to complain. And yet, this is also one of the largest pieces of land on Earth, about 1.7 million square kilometers, with a population that barely fills a major city. A vast, quiet kingdom of glaciers, volcanoes, and dark water, where nature doesn't just surround human life, it tests it. So, what carved this landscape into something so extreme, and who learned to live here first long before maps tried to name it? Alaska sits at the edge of two worlds: the calm, solid-looking surface people see on postcards, and the restless geology beneath it. From space, it appears like a jagged crescent hooked around the North Pacific. On the ground, it feels like a continent that never finished forming. Mountains rise with the blunt confidence of fresh stone. Coastlines fracture into bays and channels as if the land was snapped and pulled apart. And in many places, the ground is still quietly moving. The reason begins offshore, in the dark water of the Pacific. Here, tectonic plates meet and grind. One slab of Earth's crust is forced downward, beneath another, a process called subduction. It is slow, measured in centimeters per year, but relentless. Over millions of years, it has built Alaska like a rough seam stitched onto the planet's rim. Pieces of crust, ancient islands, fragments of seafloor blocks, of mountain rock, have been pressed, folded, and welded together. Alaska is not one simple landmass. It is a mosaic of geological stories fused into one enormous shape. That same collision explains Alaska's violence. Earthquakes are not rare punctuation marks here. They are part of the grammar. In 1964, the Great Alaska Earthquake struck with a magnitude that still ranks among the strongest ever recorded, tearing across southern Alaska and sending waves through coastal towns. The landscape recovered, as landscapes do. But the memory remained in tilted shorelines, broken forests, and the quiet awareness that the ground is never fully asleep. Along the southern edge, the consequences rise into the sky as fire. The Aleutian Islands arc like stepping stones into the ocean, and many of them are volcanoes, some steaming, some silent, some active in living memory. This is the Pacific Ring of Fire. But in Alaska, it doesn't feel like a ring. It feels like a gate, a threshold where the Earth's interior leaks heat into the weather above. Ash can drift into flight paths. Sulfur can stain the wind. And in the distance, a volcano can look like a perfect triangle, too calm to be trusted. Then there is the other sculptor of Alaska ice. If tectonics built the bones, glaciers carved the face. During the last ice age, massive sheets of ice expanded across valleys, pushing and grinding like slow bulldozers. They scraped rock into powder, deepened basins, and widened valleys into the classic U-shape that only glaciers can make. When the climate warmed, the ice retreated, but it left behind a landscape shaped by pressure and time. That is why Alaska's coast is so complex. Fjords and drowned valleys cut into the shoreline, filled by seawater, where glaciers once flowed. In places like the Inside Passage, the land breaks into thousands of islands and channels a maze where water becomes road and mountains become walls. From a boat, cliffs rise almost straight from the sea. Waterfalls appear out of nowhere, and the ocean itself looks different sometimes, dark, sometimes milky turquoise tinted by fine glacial flower rock ground so small it stays suspended like smoke in water. Inland, the story changes again. The Alaska Range rises like a spine, and Denali, the highest peak in North America, stands as a kind of weather maker, creating its own moods. The mountain is not just tall. It is massive, broad and abrupt, rising from lowlands in a way that makes it feel closer than it should. Storms catch on it. Clouds tangle around it. And when it finally clears, the peak can look less like a mountain and more like a place where the sky forgot to end. Farther north, beyond the forests, Alaska becomes quieter and harsher. The Brooks Range stretches across the upper part of the state, dividing the greener interior from the Arctic slope. Here, the climate tightens. Summers are brief, bright, and intense. Winters are long, dim, and heavy. Much of the land rests on permafrost ground that stays frozen for years at a time. It is a hidden architecture. It holds the landscape together, but it also makes it fragile. When permafrost softens, the earth can slump. Roads can buckle. Whole hillsides can slide like melting wax. And yet, even in the cold, Alaska is not uniform. Ocean currents soften parts of the southern coast, bringing moisture and milder air. Dense temperate rainforests grow where people expect only snow. Meanwhile, the interior can swing to extremes: bitter cold in winter, surprising warmth in summer, because it sits far from the moderating influence of the sea. Alaska is a single name for many climates, many terrains, many worlds pressed together. All of this raises a question that the landscape itself seems to ask: if Alaska is still being built, still shaking, still steaming, still thawing and refreezing. What does stable even mean here? To understand Alaska's wildlife, it helps to stop thinking of nature as scenery and start thinking of it as a system tight, demanding, and brilliantly efficient. Here, life doesn't simply exist. It negotiates. It pays rent in calories. It survives on timing, on migration, on the thin margin between feast and famine. And because Alaska contains so many climates in one name, it also holds a strange variety of worlds: coastal rainforests that drip with moss, interior taiga that smells like resin and cold smoke, tundra that blooms for a few frantic weeks, and seas so productive they feel like living engines. Along the southern coast, the ocean is the great provider. Cold, nutrient-rich waters feed plankton which feed fish, which feed everything else. This is why whales return humpbacks and orcas moving through channels like slow, deliberate shadows. It's why sea otters once mattered so much to the region's balance, and why seabirds crowd cliffs in summer, turning rock faces into noisy cities. Out on the water, you can witness an entire ecosystem in motion. The slap of a tail, the sudden eruption of a blow, the scatter of bait fish like a shaken handful of silver. On land, the coastal forests feel almost unfairly alive for a place known for ice. Spruce and hemlock rise like dark cathedrals. The ground is padded with ferns and wet needles. Bears move through these woods like weather-quiet, heavy inevitable. In late summer and early fall, when salmon begin pushing upstream, the rhythm of the entire landscape changes. Rivers that seemed calm become crowded with muscle and urgency. Eagles gather in trees like witnesses, and brown bears, some of the largest on earth, step into the water with a patience that looks almost human, waiting for the right moment, the right flash of red or silver. Salmon are more than a species here. They are a moving lifeline carrying ocean energy inland. When a bear drags a fish into the forest, the nutrients don't stop with that meal. They spread into soil, into plants, into insects feeding the next season's growth. In Alaska, the border between ocean and land is not a line. It is a conveyor belt. And it raises an uncomfortable question. If that conveyor belt stutters, if runs shrink, if rivers warm, what else begins to starve silently after the cameras leave? Travel inland, and the world tightens into the boreal forest, the taiga, where winters are brutal and summers are brief enough to feel like Irumur. Here, moose browse among willows in wetlands that steam on cold mornings. Wolves patrol territories that can span huge distances following the logic of prey and season. Lynx move like ghosts through snow. In the interior, it's common to feel the presence of animals without seeing them. A fresh track line stitched across a frozen river. A snapped twig. A distant sudden silence from birds that were singing seconds earlier. Then north of the trees, the tundra opens like a different planet. There are no tall forests here to soften the wind. The horizon stretches clean and exposed. In summer, the ground erupts with color. Tiny flowers, lichens, grasses, because it has so little time to grow. In winter, it becomes a monochrome test. This is caribou country, where herds can travel astonishing distances across the Arctic and subarctic, following ancient routes that exist more in memory than in maps. Their movement is not random. It's precision, written in instinct, where the snow is thinner, where insects are fewer, where fresh growth will appear first. And above all of this sits cold itself as a shaping force. The length of winter changes who can live where. The timing of freeze and thaw decides migration, breeding, and survival. Even the simplest things, like when a lake forms safe ice or when a river breaks apart, become life or death calendar events. In a place like Alaska, weather is not small talk. It is the main plot. The Arctic coast adds yet another layer: sea ice and open water as shifting territory. When ice forms, it becomes a platform. When it breaks, it becomes absence. Species like polar bears depend on the timing and extent of that platform for hunting, while seals rely on it for rest and breeding. It's a stark arrangement, almost too clean. Change the ice, and the entire story tilts. And that leads to the bigger modern tension, because Alaska is one of the places where warming trends can feel less like numbers and more like visible edits to the world. Thawing permafrost can reshape ground. Warmer seas can shift fish distributions. Earlier springs can scramble the timing between predators and prey. So the question becomes sharper when an ecosystem is built on timing. What happens when time itself changes? And yet Alaska is not only about loss or fragility. It's also about resilience, adaptation, and the raw intelligence of life. Watch a bear choose the easiest crossing point in a rushing river. Watch a wolf test the wind before committing to a hunt. Watch a seabird return to the exact same cliff year after year, as if the rock itself is home. These aren't just animals in nature. They are specialists refined by harshness. There's also a deeper way. Alaska's biodiversity tells a story. It reveals how connected everything is. A whale feed depends on the health of the ocean. A salmon run depends on cold, clean rivers and stable seasonal patterns. A forest's growth can be influenced by fish nutrients. A village's food security can be tied to migration and ice. In Alaska, ecology is not separate from human life. It overlaps constantly. This is why the best wildlife moments here often feel like revelations rather than spectacles. It's not the dramatic leap of a breaching whale alone. It's the realization that the whale is here because the water, the plankton, the fish, and the seasons are aligned. It's not the sight of a caribou herd alone. It's the awareness that you are watching a living tradition older than most recorded history. And it's not the beauty of a glacier blue river alone. It's the knowledge that this color comes from rock ground by ice, an entire geological process turned into a visible shade. Alaska's biodiversity is in the end a kind of honesty. It shows what life looks like when comfort is removed. It shows what survives when the rules are strict. And it quietly asks something back of us. If this place can endure so much cold distance darkness, why does it feel like the most fragile thing is the future we're writing for it? Before Alaska was a state, before it was a purchase, a frontier, or a postcard, it was a corridor, a threshold, a place where continents nearly touched, and where human history quietly changed direction. During colder eras, sea levels dropped, and a broad land bridge connected Asia and North America. This lost landscape is often called Beringia. It wasn't a single narrow path. It was an immense region of steppe and tundra, wide enough to hold rivers, grazing animals, and seasons. And for early peoples, it offered something priceless in a harsh world movement: choice. A chance to follow food, water, and shelter across a continent that still had no borders. Over thousands of years, different groups spread, settled, adapted, and became rooted in Alaska's many ecosystems. Some lived along coasts where the sea provided steady calories. Others moved through forests and river valleys where fish runs and big game shaped the calendar. And across the north, where winter could last most of the year, communities learned not only how to endure cold, but how to build a culture that could breathe inside it. This is where Alaska's first truth becomes clear. Survival here was never just about strength. It was about knowledge, deep inherited knowledge of ice animals, storms, and timing. And that knowledge did not come from books or maps. It came from memory, from careful watching, and from stories repeated until they became a kind of living compass. Along the Arctic coast and across the northern interior lived the ancestors of today's Inupiat and other northern peoples, shaped by a world of wind and sea ice. Here, the ocean was not a boundary. It was a hunting ground, sometimes generous, sometimes merciless. Sea mammals, seal, walrus, whale, could mean warmth, food tools, and light in a single animal. The relationship with these animals was never casual. It was layered with rules, respect, and responsibility, because in an environment this severe, taking life without honoring it was not just immoral, it was dangerous. On the western coasts and river deltas, Yupik communities developed lives intertwined with water, the long braids of rivers, the shallow edges of the Bering Sea, the seasonal arrival of fish and birds. In these regions, timing was everything. Salmon runs didn't simply provide food, they structured the year. When the fish arrived, work turned urgent. Smokehouses filled the air with a sweet, sharp scent. Families gathered for processing and preserving because winter was not a surprise here. It was an appointment that never missed. Farther south and across island chains, the ancestors of the Unangan Aleut and Alutiiq Sugpiaq peoples became masters of the sea. On the Aleutian Islands, storms can rise with terrifying speed, and the ocean can feel like a living wall. Yet people built lives here anyway, on cliffs and coves, among fog and seabird colonies, learning routes, currents, and safe landings the way others learned streets. Boats were not just transportation, they were survival technology. Skin-covered craft, carefully made, turned water into road. Seamanship became a form of literacy passed from generation to generation. In the southeast, where the climate softens into forests and rain communities such as the Tlingit Haida and Tsimshian lived among cedar salmon streams and islands that feel like labyrinths. Here, culture expressed itself in carved forms and social systems as complex as the coastline. Clan identity, oral history, and ceremony were not decorations placed on survival. They were the architecture of community. In a world where winter storms could isolate villages and food needed careful management, social structure became a technology too, one that protected resources, mediated conflict, and preserved identity. Different regions, different languages, different ways of living, yet all linked by the same principle. Alaska did not reward improvisation. It rewarded those who listened. The most powerful invention Alaska's early peoples carried was not a tool, it was a worldview. In many indigenous traditions across Alaska, the land is not inert property. It is alive with agency. Animals are not just prey. They are beings with presence deserving ceremony and care. Water, wind, and ice are not backdrops. They are forces that can be read and respected. This belief system was not abstract philosophy. It was practical. When life depends on the next seal surfacing, the next salmon run returning, or the next storm holding off long enough to travel, humility becomes a survival trait. This worldview shaped behavior in ways outsiders sometimes misunderstood. There were protocols for handling food, for sharing meat, for speaking about animals, for returning bones, or parts in respectful ways. There were stories, some playful, some terrifying, that taught children how to behave around thin ice, dangerous rivers, or unpredictable wildlife. Masks, dances, and songs were not merely art. They were memory devices storing knowledge in rhythm and image. And Alaska demanded not just spiritual alignment, but engineering. In the north and west, semi-subterranean homes could shelter families from the worst wind-trapping heat and offering stability in a landscape that tried to steal warmth from the body. In coastal areas where trees were scarce, people used what the sea and shore provided: driftwood bonehide, stone turning scarcity into design. Clothing became a science-layered skins, careful stitching insulation built from experience. Every seam mattered. Every failure taught harsh lessons. Trade networks also threaded through this world long before foreign ships appeared on the horizon. Materials moved stone for tools, copper shells, specialized goods, carried along rivers, coasts, and seasonal routes. Information moved to news of weather game movement, safe crossings. Alaska was not a silent wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was a populated, connected homeland full of roots and relationships, invisible to anyone who didn't know how to look. And then there is the deeper fact that modern maps struggle to show Alaska's people were never just in the environment. They were part of it. They shaped landscapes with camps, trails, fish weirs, and seasonal harvest patterns. They managed resources through tradition and social rules. They passed on knowledge so refined that it could predict when ice would begin to shift, where animals would appear, and how to survive a whiteout when the world disappears. If survival in Alaska required such intelligence, then what happens when the environment itself begins to change its rules? Even in the earliest times, Alaska was not static. Coastlines shifted. Glaciers advanced and retreated. Storm patterns changed. And people adapted, sometimes by moving, sometimes by redefining what home meant. For many communities, life followed a seasonal round summer abundance gathered and stored for winter scarcity, spring and fall used for travel, hunting, and preparation. This rhythm created a particular kind of emotional discipline. There was celebration, yes, but also constant awareness. In a place where one failed season could echo into the next community was not optional. Sharing was not charity, it was continuity. This is also why Alaska's early cultures developed such strong storytelling traditions. Stories carried rules, warnings, humor, identity, and grief. They explained why certain places were dangerous. They preserved histories of migrations, disasters, and victories. They reminded listeners that humans were not the center of the world, hear only one voice in a much larger choir. Over time, new presences would approach foreign ships, new economies, new diseases, new political borders. The change would not arrive all at once. It would seep in through coastlines and trading posts, through language and law. And the tension would sharpen into a question Alaska still carries today. When outsiders arrive with their own maps and meanings, what happens to a homeland that already had names, stories, and rules? Because the moment exploration becomes history, something else also begins a struggle over who gets to define a place. And that sets the stage for the next chapter, when Alaska's shores stop being only the edge of a continent and start becoming the edge of an empire. When outsiders first approached Alaska by sea, they didn't see a last frontier. They saw opportunity, an edge of the world that could be turned into profit, prestige, and control. The coastline that Indigenous communities read like a living language looked to foreign empires like a blank margin. And in that misunderstanding, Alaska's modern history began. In the 1700s, Russian expeditions pushed eastward across Siberia and into the North Pacific, chasing a commodity that would shape Alaska for generations' fur. Sea otter pelts, dense, dark, almost impossibly soft, became a luxury item in global trade. What followed was not a gentle meeting of worlds. It was extraction competition and pressure. Trading posts grew into footholds. Footholds became claims. Claims became a new name, Russian America. Settlements, such as Sitka, developed as administrative and commercial centers tied to the Russian-American Company and the logic of empire. But Alaska was never an easy possession. Distance was brutal. Storms were constant. Supply lines stretched thin across oceans and ice. profit demanded more hunting, more labor, more control. Yet the land resisted being simplified. Even the sea, the very highway that made colonization possible, could cut ships off for months. And while company records spoke in numbers and shipments, local life felt the impact in far more personal terms: disrupted hunting grounds, coerced labor violence, and disease. Entire communities faced waves of illness they had never encountered before. In places where survival depended on knowledge passed down over centuries, a new kind of threat arrived, one that knowledge could not easily predict. So here is the first hard question of Alaska's colonial era: when a place is treated as a resource, what happens to the people who have always treated it as home? Other powers soon entered the picture. British explorers mapped and measured their journals, describing coastlines, currents, and harbors with a cold precision. Names were written onto bays and mountains. Lines were sketched across water. The act of discovering often meant declaring that what was already known did not count. Yet, Alaska refused to become fully legible. The geography was too intricate, the weather too violent, the distances too extreme. The same fjords and island chains that protected communities could confuse navies. The interior dense forests braided rivers. Mountain ranges remained a world apart from the coastal trade routes. For decades, much of Alaska stayed beyond the practical reach of outsiders, not because it was empty, but because it was vast and demanding. Then, in 1867, Russia sold Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million. From the perspective of governments, it was a transaction paper ink and a price tag. From the perspective of a landscape and its people, it was something stranger, the idea that a homeland could change ownership without the consent of those who lived there. The flag changed. The rules began to change. But the rivers still ran, the storms still rose, the animals still migrated. Alaska continued being Alaska, while new authorities tried to decide what Alaska should become. At first, the American presence felt uneven. There were military posts, missionaries, traders, and officials, yet vast areas remained governed by distance and necessity more than by law. Over time, industries expanded along the coasts, fishing fleets, canneries, and shipping routes that tied Alaska's resources to distant markets. Towns grew where the economy demanded them. Some survived, others faded, leaving behind pilings, rusted machinery, and names that sounded like ghosts on old maps. And beneath all of this ran a quieter story. Indigenous communities navigating a rapidly shifting world, pressured to abandon languages, spiritual traditions, and ways of living that had been perfectly adapted to the environment. The struggle was not only against poverty or policy, it was against the idea that progress required forgetting. But history in Alaska rarely stays quiet for long. Because in the late 1800s, one word detonated like a flare across the North Gold. Gold rushes didn't just bring people to Alaska. They brought a mood, feverish, impatient, and hungry. Sudden boom towns appeared at the edges of rivers and coastlines swelling with thousands who arrived convinced that wealth was buried nearby. Trails turned into supply routes. Ports turned into gateways. Places like Skagway became synonymous with the chaotic theater of stampedes, narrow streets packed with cargo saloons, scams, and exhausted men trying to buy luck one shovel at a time. In the far west, Nome saw its own rush, one so intense that people literally fought over claims and ground tearing at sand and gravel under brutal conditions. The dream was simple: endure the cold long enough to become rich. The reality was often harsher: injury, disappointment, and towns that emptied as fast as they filled. Yet even when the gold thinned out, the infrastructure remained: docks, roads, administrative control, and a new narrative of Alaska as a place to be conquered. Then came the 20th century, and with it, a different kind of strategic value. During World War II, Alaska became more than distant territory. It became a front line. Battles and occupations in the Aleutian Islands brought war into places that had already endured so much change. Communities were relocated. Landscapes were militarized. Runways and bases appeared carved into earth and rock. Alaska's remoteness, once its protection, became its geopolitical importance. The edge of the world was suddenly the edge of conflict. After the war, the pace of modernization accelerated. Alaska became a state in 1959, but statehood did not solve the basic contradiction. How does a modern economy take shape in a place where nature still sets the terms, roads and air routes expanded? Cities like Anchorage grew into logistical hubs where supplies and people could be organized before being scattered outward into smaller towns and remote villages. And then in 1968, the discovery of major oil reserves at Prudhoe Bay reshaped Alaska's future with a force as dramatic as any gold rush, only longer lasting and far more industrial. Oil demanded engineering on a continental scale. It demanded a pipeline that could cross mountains, rivers, and permafrost, an 800-mile steel artery running from the Arctic to the port at Valdez. It was presented as a triumph technology over distance profit, over difficulty, a promise of revenue that could fund public services and transform lives. But it also reopened the oldest question in Alaska's modern story. When wealth flows out of the ground, who truly benefits and what pays the hidden cost? If the pipeline symbolized ambition, then the Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989 became a symbol of consequence. Oil spread through Prince William Sound, darkening water that once looked like polished glass. Wildlife suffered. Shorelines were stained. And the damage wasn't only ecological, it was emotional, cultural, and economic, especially for communities whose lives were tied to fishing and the health of the sea. Disasters like this do something specific to a place like Alaska. They strip away the myth that nature is an infinite sponge, able to absorb any mistake. They remind everyone, companies, governments, travelers, that the environment here is not a backdrop. It is the foundation. And when the foundation is harmed, everything above it trembles. Yet Alaska's history is not a simple march from wild to developed. It is a constant negotiation between extremes, resource extraction, and conservation economic opportunity, and cultural survival, modern infrastructure, and ancient knowledge. Some towns thrive on tourism, now welcoming cruise ships and camera lenses selling the idea of Alaska as pure wilderness. while the real Alaska includes complicated politics, complicated trade-offs, and communities trying to protect identity in a fast-changing world. And the change is no longer only political or industrial. It is environmental. Warmer temperatures reshape ice. Thawing permafrost threatens roads and buildings. Shifting oceans affect fish. In a place where history has always been written by what the land allows, the land itself is beginning to rewrite the rules. So the question that closes this chapter is not only historical, it is immediate. If Alaska has always balanced on the edge of empire industry and survival, what happens when the edge itself starts to move? Modern Alaska is often sold as a promise, pure wilderness, clean air glaciers glowing blue under midnight sun. But the lived reality is more complicated and in many ways more human. Because Alaska today is not only a landscape, it is a set of choices. And those choices are being made under pressure from three directions at once: climate change, economic dependence on resource industries, and the growing weight of tourism and global attention. The first pressure is the most quietly relentless warming in the Arctic. In places like Alaska, climate change isn't only a future projection. It shows up as timing problems. Rivers freeze later. Ice becomes less predictable. Storm patterns shift. Permafrost, once the hidden glue of the North, softens, destabilizes the ground. This isn't just a scientific concern. It becomes personal when roads buckle, when homes tilt, when whole sections of coastline erode, and when communities face relocation, not because they want a new start, but because the land under them is literally disappearing. And this is where Alaska's modern tension becomes painful. Many of the communities most affected are also those who contributed least to the warming. Remote villages that have lived with ice and wind for generations now find that the ice no longer behaves like it used to. A hunting route that was safe for decades becomes risky in a single season. An old rule, "This is when the freeze comes," stops working. When survival depends on predictability, unpredictability is a crisis. The second pressure is economic, and it often forces Alaska into uncomfortable trade-offs. Oil revenue has funded public services, and shaped political decisions for decades. The pipeline is still there, a symbol of both prosperity and dependence. But the world's energy conversation is changing, and Alaska is caught in the middle, an economy built on extraction, facing a future that demands transition. The debate is rarely simple. For some, resource development means job stability and the ability to remain in communities that would otherwise have few economic options. For others, it means risk, especially in a place where spills, industrial accidents, and fragile ecosystems can leave scars that last for generations. Fishing is another foundation and another vulnerability. Alaska's identity is deeply tied to the sea commercial fisheries, subsistence harvest seasonal work that defines entire regions. But fisheries depend on healthy oceans, and healthy oceans depend on temperature currents and food webs. When those shift, the consequences ripple outward. Fewer fish can mean fewer jobs, less food security, and a cultural loss that can't be replaced with money. And then there's tourism, the camera-shaped pressure that grows every year. Cruise ships glide into coastal towns. Tour buses roll toward viewpoints. Hikers fill trails that once belonged mostly to wind and silence. Tourism brings income, absolutely. It keeps small businesses alive and connects Alaska to the global imagination. But it also introduces a difficult imbalance. A place becomes something to be consumed, and the people who live there become part of the experience. In the most crowded seasons, Alaska can feel like two realities layered on top of each other. One is the visitor's Alaska short bright curated. The other is the resident's Alaska logistical expensive demanding. Groceries can cost more. Heating can strain budgets. Medical access can be limited in remote areas. Winter darkness can affect mental health. And in villages, the question is not, where should we visit next? But how do we keep young people here while still protecting who we are? Yet Alaska's living culture is not defined only by struggle. It is also defined by stubborn creativity. In cities like Anchorage and Fairbanks, you can see modern Alaska negotiating its identity in real-time native corporations and cultural organizations, working to protect language and traditions, artists blending contemporary forms with ancestral motifs, young people reclaiming stories that were once discouraged. In smaller towns, culture often shows up, not as performance, but as community habit. The way neighbors share supplies, the way people prepare for winter, the way everyone knows that in an emergency, you don't ask. Is it my job? You just help. Seasonal festivals and traditions also reveal how Alaska turns hardship into meaning. The Iditarod, for example, is more than a race. It's a public ritual of endurance and relationship between humans, dogs, and environment. Winter celebrations in many towns aren't denial of darkness, they're a refusal to let darkness win. Even small acts, ice fishing, berry picking, salmon smoking, carry a cultural weight here because they connect people to place in a practical way. And throughout Alaska, Indigenous voices continue to reshape what progress means. For many communities, the goal is not to freeze culture in the past like a museum exhibit. The goal is continuity, adapting without disappearing. That can mean protecting subsistence rights, defending land and water, teaching language to children, and insisting that policy decisions include the people most tied to the environment. It can also mean telling outsiders a truth Alaska has always carried. You can't love this place, honestly, if you only love the postcard version of it. Because Alaska is not a theme park. It is a homeland. It is also a warning light. The landscape that once seemed eternal glaciers, sea ice, stable permafrost has always been dynamic, yes. But now, it is changing faster, pushed by forces that originate far beyond Alaska's borders. And that leaves the state in a strange position. It is both a beneficiary of global demand for resources and a frontline witness to global warming's consequences. So, the modern question becomes sharper than ever. Can Alaska remain? Alaska wild, inhabited, culturally rich, without being sacrificed to the world's appetite for beauty, energy, and spectacle. There is a final tension that runs through all of this scale. Alaska is enormous, but many communities are small. Decisions made in distant capitals about energy markets, shipping routes, climate policy can land here like sudden weather. And yet Alaska also shows something powerful, that resilience is not just survival. It is adaptation with dignity. If the past chapters were about how Alaska was shaped by tectonic's ice migration empire, this chapter is about who shapes Alaska now. Scientists, politicians, companies, tourists, indigenous leaders, local families, teenagers deciding whether to leave or stay. All of them pulling on the same story from different sides. And that sets up the ending, not as a neat conclusion, but as a choice we're all part of, whether Alaska becomes a place we merely admire from afar, or a place we learn to protect in a way that respects both the land and the people who live on it. Alaska is often described as the edge of the world, but after traveling through its story, through fire, beneath the ocean ice, carved into valleys, migrations across vanished land bridges, and centuries of trade ambition and survival, it starts to feel like something else. It feels like a mirror. Because Alaska shows what the planet looks like when nature still holds the final vote. It shows how fragile comfort really is when the temperature drops past human imagination. It shows how ecosystems depend on timing so precise that a single shift can echo through rivers, forests, and coastlines. And it shows how people, especially indigenous communities, built lives here not by conquering the land, but by learning its rules, reading its warnings, and passing that knowledge down like a flame protected from wind. But Alaska also carries scars, the legacy of colonization extraction, and the dangerous belief that distance makes consequences disappear. The pipeline, the boom towns, the oil-stained shorelines, these aren't footnotes. They are reminders that the edge of the world has always been treated as a place where risks can be pushed outward away from sight. Now the edge is speaking back. Warming patterns shift ice and seasons. Coastlines erode. Permafrost loosens. Salmon and oceans feel different. And the question is no longer just what Alaska is, it's what Alaska is becoming. So if this film leaves you with anything, let it be this: admire Alaska, yes, but don't reduce it to scenery. Learn its history. Respect the people whose cultures are rooted here. If you travel, travel gently. Support local communities and responsible guides. Pay attention to conservation work. And when you see the next headline about melting ice or changing oceans, remember that Alaska is not an abstract place. It is a living home at the planet's frontier. Because on a map, the edge is just a border. But in reality, the edge is often where the truth arrives first.